I've often challenged the rigid distinction between rationalism and mysticism, and I've argued that this distinction says more about where we find ourselves in intellectual history than how one goes about searching for fundamental truth. Perhaps no philosopher has been caught in this tug-of-war between rationalism and mysticism than Baruch Spinoza, derided as a heretic whose ideas were tantamount to atheistic rationalism and praised as a man nothing short of intoxicated with God. Spinoza's philosophy cannot be so easily captured by simplistic and blunt analysis. In this episode, I want to explore the history of this tug-of-war between the rational Spinoza with his geometric logical method and a more hermetic, mystical Spinoza as a philosopher of immanent divine joy. This episode is also special because it's part of a collaboration with my friend and colleague Zevi over at Seekers of Unity. Of the people I've met over the years exploring mysticism, Zevi is among the most impressive. He manages to strike a balance between intellectual rigor and deep sensitivity on a topic that is as important for grasping the human experience as it is deeply difficult to study. Make sure to check out his project over at Seekers of Unity. You can check it out at the card above for a wide range of explorations of mysticism, including this series on pantheism, where we're working together to dive a bit deeper into the philosophy of Spinoza. And if you're interested in Hermetic philosophy, mysticism, or magic, make sure to subscribe and check out my other content as well. And if you want to support my work of making scholarly, accessible, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, you may want to consider supporting my work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Your support of Esoterica really does make this channel possible. I really appreciate it, and you can find those links below. So let's turn to the philosophy of Spinoza, the heretical atheist, the mystic of immanence, or both. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Baruch Spinoza was born on the 24th of November, 1632, to a mercantile family who had spent generations as refugees following the Alhambra decree, which, in 1492, expelled hundreds of thousands of Jews from Spain. From what we can tell, he was raised in a relatively orthodox background, receiving a traditional Jewish education, along with learning his family business. Though it appears that in his late teens or early 20s, he began to frequent the association of certain radical Protestant followers of the philosopher Descartes. You know, I think, therefore I am Descartes. While the reasons aren't exactly clear, Spinoza was subject to the cherem, or the excommunication from the Jewish community, on the 27th of July, 1656, at the age of 23. It seems that the excommunication was probably for several reasons, some of which included his emergent critical approach to the Hebrew Bible, his likely embrace of at least some aspects of the Cartesian philosophy, which at that time was considered kind of like an atheism, though Descartes does give three different proofs, at least three different proofs, for the existence of God throughout the Meditations and all of his other works, so whatever atheism means when it comes to Cartesianism. Aside from theological and philosophical heterodoxy, Baruch was also in a dispute with his sister about the family business following their father's death, and temporary excommunication was sometimes used in the Amsterdam Jewish community as a means of enforcing social compliance. The excommunication decree was actually reconsidered in December of 2015 by the Amsterdam Jewish community. It was actually upheld. He's still excommunicated. Their argument? Why should the community change the decree when Spinoza himself expressed no interest in it being lifted? Spinoza wished to be in exile, and thus it was and should be. We may very well never know the reasons, but the writ of excommunication, while somewhat formulaic, is dreadful actually to read. What's fascinating is that while expelled from the Jewish community, Spinoza never converted to another religion, much to the confusion and chagrin of the times. In some sense, this makes Spinoza among the first figures to live outside of the system of organized religion at all. It may, in fact, make him something like the first secular person in Europe. I've always seen this as a testament to the strength of his character and the integrity of his beliefs. I mean, can you imagine the courage it must have taken to live as both ethnically Jewish, with all of the anti-Semitism that came along with that at that time, but also excommunicated from even the comforts of being a second-class citizen? Spinoza faced an exile within an exile within an exile. Though we shouldn't think of him as a hermit, he met with and corresponded with numerous examples of the rising bourgeois intellectual world, including Leibniz, the philosopher and co-inventor of the calculus, and Henry Oldenburg, the first secretary of the Royal Academy and the inventor of the modern system of peer review. Indeed, the lenses that Spinoza ground as his vocation, how he made a living, helped nascent astronomers like Huygens peer deeper into space and thus into time. Those very lenses likely also contributed to his death, likely by something like scoliosis, on the 21st of February 1677 at the young age of 44. His most important metaphysical works being so controversial they could only be published following his death. That very year, Spinoza's central metaphysical document, the Ethics, first appeared, and the debate over just what kind of philosophy this was hasn't ceased to this day. Was Spinoza an atheist that simply used the term God as a synonym for nature? Or was he a kind of mystical pantheist for whom nature was the immanence of God, or something altogether more complex? Spinoza's metaphysical legacy remains one of the most complex and difficult to settle in philosophical history. A very basic outline of the Ethics runs something like this. God, or nature, Deus sive natura, to use Spinoza's language, is the only true substance of which everything else as we know them are modes or modulations of that substance, understood under the attributes of either extension, the aspect of matter, or thought, or through the aspect of the mind. Of course, God, or nature, has infinite attributes. We human beings only perceive those of thought and extension. Somewhat like Neoplatonic philosophy, between the infinity of God and the finiteness of individuals stands the finite and infinite mediate and immediate modes of both thought and extension. These comprise the total system of motion and rest, one could even use the word energy, of matter, along with the spatial system of those bodies as the mediate and immediate modes of extension, which Spinoza refers to rather mysteriously as the, quote, face of the entire universe. Similarly, the totality of all information being processed in reality is the, quote, absolutely infinite understanding, comprising the immediate, infinite, eternal mode of thought. The mediate, infinite, and eternal mode of thought remains rather unclear in Spinoza's system, though one could perhaps deduce that it must be something like the totality of all minds, mine, yours, every mind, such they, quote, constitute at the same time the eternal and infinite intellect of God, as Spinoza puts it, though exactly what this is remains, like I said, a bit mysterious. That mode of substance, remember God, our nature, that is the human being, us, like all beings, strives to persist in being by an internal ontological force that Spinoza calls conatus. However, unlike many other beings, human conatus operates under and perceives the attribute of mind as much as its physical extension. Despite the perfection of being itself, the human mind is often limited by incorrect, corrupt, or otherwise inadequate ideas, especially forms of pesky emotions, what Spinoza calls the sad passions. By clarifying our mental perception of being, our nature, our God, we ascend through 3 stages of intellection, whereby confused and inadequate ideas give way to a final realization of our place within the perfect system of God, our nature. By perceiving ourselves from this God's eye perspective, we're no longer the slave to our sad passions like hatred or greed or any other kinds of inadequate ideas, but rather we experience a kind of interior freedom where peace of mind, scientific clarity, and emotional tranquility all exist together in a state which Spinoza calls true blessedness. Now, I'm not going to pretend that my summary here does any justice to Spinoza's system. Oh yeah, did I mention that the Ethics is written like a geometry textbook with axioms and definitions and propositions following one from another via logical deductions with the occasional scolia and lemata to break it all up. This is referred to as the more geometrico, and it often proves to be a serious barrier for studying Spinoza's thought. Indeed, this all allows me to set up the question that is in fact the most germane one here in our study. Was Spinoza a mystical pantheist whose system seeks human unity with the divine, or was he just basically an atheist who only used God language to escape being completely written off and even persecuted by his contemporaries, and whose system basically leads to, well, nihilism? This question is very difficult to answer despite the fact that Spinoza wrote the Ethics in the geometric mode precisely such that the reader would perceive his ideas as clear and distinct. So what's going on here exactly? I think that we can only begin to answer that question by in fact exploring previous answers to just this problem. Atheist or mystic? A starting problem is the context of Spinoza's writing more generally. As you can probably imagine, during his life, Spinoza's thought was incredibly controversial. One of only 2 books he published during his lifetime, the Theological Political Tract of 1670, which criticized traditional interpretation of scriptures and argued for freedom of conscience and speech about religion, had to be published anonymously. Indeed, the printer even forged a false printer's mark to hide its origin. It was said to have been printed in Hamburg, Germany by one Heinricus Kunrath, clearly a reference to the Hermetic alchemist Heinrich Kunrath, who died in 1605. Why attribute the text to Kunrath? Well, here we already have a kind of Hermetic link to Spinoza, and it's perhaps that Kunrath already published such unusual Hermetic alchemical text that such an avant-garde theological political text would be weird enough to group them together. Regardless, the Amsterdam censor was not tricked by this attempt at subterfuge and declared that the book was, quote, forged in hell by the devil and a renegade Jew. One could only hope to get such a rave review these days on any book of philosophy that one could imagine publishing. The Theological Political Tract was scandalous from the very beginning for basically declaring that religions as we know them are, quote, superstitions, and that such superstitions cannot validate state power, thus arguing for the de facto separation of church and state. Further, he criticized the traditional understanding of the Hebrew Bible by engaging in a very close reading of the text in the original Hebrew. He argued against the reality of miracles, and he argued for freedom of speech and freedom of conscience, specifically vis-a-vis institutional religion. While Leo Strauss has pointed out that the theological political tract is a kind of esoteric text, it doesn't take much reading between the lines to see that this book was a bombshell for a world dominated by institutional religion, which underwrote state power. Unsurprisingly, Spinoza quickly gained a reputation for being a notorious atheist. Indeed, the term Spinozist and atheist became interchangeable in the years following his death, a shift that I think the followers of Descartes really welcomed. They were also typically known as atheists. Indeed, Spinoza came to deride the, quote, stupid Cartesians for promulgating this charge of atheism, one which he strenuously denied. Well, he denied merely physical extension existed. I'm not sure that makes him a theist in the robust sense, but still. Of course, in the theological political tract, the state can oblige one to believe in God and the, quote, divine law, that whatever is hateful to yourself you shouldn't do to your neighbor. But again, what's going on here? Let's read between the lines. The moral law can be derived from the, quote, natural light of reason, and the God in that text that one is obliged to believe in is simply the result of a logical deduction about the principle of sufficient reason as it applies to the world. That is, the world has to have some kind of cause. That cause we simply call God. But note, there is very little traditional aspects of God, either Jewish or Christian, in terms that would have been understood by his contemporaries, and people at the time certainly realized that. Further, we learned in the Ethics that Spinoza's God not only does not perform miracles, but takes no notice of human beings at all. It's foolish, Spinoza notes, to pray or even love God with the expectation that God hears or loves you back. And his God has neither will, nor intellect, nor feeling, but operates according to the necessary laws internal to it, of which the modes, including us, are equally locked into this vast system of necessary determination. This is not a God that hears your prayers to help you pass your calculus exams. Indeed, one may wonder if you were to do a kind of search and replace throughout Spinoza's Ethics, which sounds somewhat mystical, even Neoplatonic at times, and just replace the term God with nature, which Spinoza himself seems to think would be completely appropriate, Deus sive natura, would anything of philosophical or theological merit be lost in the substitution? And this is what's maddening about this question. There are reasons from Spinoza to indicate no, the system is a form of theological naturalism for which God is simply identified with nature in a kind of God equals nature equation, God having no separate ontological reality apart from the total system of nature. This seems to be what Albert Einstein thought when he was asked by Rabbi Herbert Goldstein in 1929 if he, Einstein, believed in God. Einstein actually wrote back, quote, "I believe in Spinoza's God who reveals himself in the lawful harmony of the world, not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and the doings of mankind." Although Einstein may even be a bit more of a theist than this read of Spinoza, the Einsteinian Spinozist God still, quote, reveals the, quote, lawful harmony of the world, whereas that is precisely what's up for debate in this question. Though Einstein was a physicist and not a theologian or a philosopher. So, Regardless, in the years following his death, Spinoza was certainly derided as an atheist whose theological deflation simply reduced God to nature, thus effectively rejecting the existence of any deity at all. You can see this attitude expressed in early images of Spinoza, where he is simply described as Judaeus et Atheistia, Jew and atheist. However, by the early 18th century, this would begin to change, if ever so slightly. In 1699, Wachter for the first time links Spinoza's thought with the Jewish mystical speculations of the Kabbalah. Ever since then, numerous scholars have attempted to find a clear and distinct link between Kabbalistic writings on the one hand and Spinoza's system on the other, though I think to little avail ultimately. To what degree Spinoza learned Kabbalah before his excommunication isn't clear, though it was certainly in the air. Shabbatai Tzvi was declared Messiah in the summer of 1665, about 9 years after Spinoza was excommunicated. Spinoza was even asked his opinion about the whole Shabbatai Tzvi Messiah business, but sadly, his reply has not survived. Though I can't imagine him being terribly impressed by the Kabbalistic Messiah. Though, at least in the early Spinoza, such as his treatise on the improvement of the intellect of around 1662, we read that the goal of philosophy is, quote, the knowledge of the union that the mind has with the whole of nature. This sounds quite mystical without getting too much into the weeds of what that mysticism might be. Though I should point out that Spinoza mentions the Kabbalah by name only once in his surviving writings, and it's not a rosy reference. We read in the theological political tract mentioned earlier of about 1670 that, quote, I have also read and am acquainted with a number of Kabbalistic triflers, whose insanity passes the bounds of my understanding. If Spinoza's system were influenced by Kabbalah, it seems to have been at best indirect, perhaps through Ibn Ezra, whose own Kabbalistic signposts are themselves intentionally hidden in his biblical commentaries, or perhaps through the influence of Abraham Cohen de Herrera, as Miguel Bertrand has argued. Indeed, speculations about the origin of Spinoza's pantheism reach far and wide, from perennial philosophy to possible Sufi contact through his father's business, to Renaissance Hermeticism, especially Giordano Bruno, and of course, Kabbalah. Though I have to say that I find the similarities between Spinoza's system and Kabbalah, or even other forms of monism like those of Advaita Vedanta or the teachings of the Upanishads, to be much more the result of typological homology rather than direct or indirect intellectual influence. To this day, scholars have been unable to point to a single direct influence from any of these sources. For instance, to my knowledge, there is no evidence that Spinoza even read Giordano Bruno, much less was influenced by him in his thinking. Despite this, one of the most influential histories of philosophy in English by the Jesuit Frederick Copleston still forwards the theory that Bruno ultimately influences Spinoza, despite the fact that we have no reason really to believe that. Indeed, I think much of this confusion is from people not reading Spinoza on his own terms. One of the key strengths of Spinoza's system is that he very, very carefully stipulates every major philosophical term in his project. So terms like God, substance, attribute, mode, essence, mind, extension, while having their origins in the lexicon of medieval scholasticism, are given radically innovative definitions in Spinoza's system. I mean, so radical that God becomes an extended thing in his thinking. This is an absolutely heretical idea in any school of medieval philosophy. The mistake I think people make, and continue to make, is that they read terms that they are familiar with, or they think that they're familiar with, like God, and rather than understand them strictly in the way that Spinoza meant for them to operate in his system, they begin to play fast and loose with similar terms in other philosophical systems that use similar kinds of ideas. While the terms are perhaps verbally the same, I use God, you use God, Aquinas uses God, Spinoza uses God, to equivocate on their use in the Spinoza system as they appear in other schools of thought virtually necessitates a misreading of Spinoza's ideas. Thus, Spinoza ends up being cast in the light of Kabbalah or Advaita Vedanta or even mechanical materialism, all the while the actual Spinoza system is misread, misunderstood, and decomposed as if by a worm in its blood. Sorry, that's a pretty obscure Spinoza reference. Indeed, one of the studies I most admire of Spinoza is the deeply critical analysis of Jonathan Bennett, precisely because he takes the inner world of Spinoza's system in absolute serious and painstaking detail. Of course, it's such an eviscerating take on Spinoza's thought that it sometimes brought me to tears, but the rigor of the dissection, how much care Bennett shows precisely by his mastery of Spinoza's thought on exactly Spinoza's terms, is positively breathtaking. And personally, I think that a criticism that takes a thinker radically serious on their own terms is far superior to any superficial fanboyism. Authentic criticism is almost always an act of admiration. Or at least I tell myself that when I read some of y'all's comments. Thank you. Sadly, the early history of the reception of Spinoza's philosophy was rarely from actually reading his works. Indeed, the inadequate summary of his ideas by Pierre Bayle in 1697 was the most common and popular, and often this version was attacked as if it were a true account of Spinozism. Similarly defective, though popular French summaries of the time would also go on to influence the militant anti-religion and libertine thought of the 18th century. In 1705, the Irish Lockean philosopher John Toland actually coined the term pantheism to describe the philosophy in which God was identified with nature, a position he ascribed to both Spinoza and Moses, like biblical Moses for some reason. It's just worth repeating that the term pantheism was basically invented to describe what Toland took to be Spinoza's system, so the link between pantheism, the word at least, literally begins with an analysis of the philosophy of Spinoza, though this is clearly indicating a kind of theological naturalism. However, the atheistic, naturalistic destroyer of religious superstition would give way to a far more Baroque concept of Spinoza's thought. Through the 18th century, especially in France, Spinoza's system would not only be employed as part of the attack on traditional religion, but also, and to some degree ironically, as an attack on what was perceived as the mechanical philosophy of the radical materialists. The mechanists, as you may remember, held that the world was something akin to a vast machine in which every element functioned like the components of a clock. Here, the world was understood fundamentally, and really, only under the guise of physical extension, or matter in motion. However, discoveries in biology, and especially questions about how inorganic matter could give rise not only to organic life, but also to consciousness, prompted a new kind of interest in Spinoza. Recall that in Spinoza's system, God or nature could be understood by both the attributes of thought and extension. thought was just as much a fundamental aspect of reality as physical objects extended in space. In this reading, the cosmos becomes something like a vast, living entity rather than a mere mechanism. Spinoza's system becomes read as a kind of vast cosmic vitalism. Indeed, it's a kind of early panpsychism, with nature itself being just as much consciousness as physical extension, with our singular consciousnesses being but modes of this vast cosmic consciousness. This vitalist shift, especially in French thinking about Spinoza, continues in some sense to this day, as we'll see when we get to figures like Deleuze in a moment. Of course, at the same time that Spinoza is being biologized in France, his thought becomes the center of an intellectual firestorm in Germany and the Enlightenment. Not to get too much into the weeds of the so-called pantheismus or the pantheism controversy, the central question of the controversy was this: does the Enlightenment, with its focus on the supremacy of reason, ultimately lead to pantheism and, by logical extension, to atheism? Of course, this is a major concern because many Enlightenment thinkers held that some kind of détente could be achieved between faith and reason. You can think of something like Immanuel Kant's famous 1793 book, Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone. However, Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi argued that lurking behind the Enlightenment was a vast gulf of not just atheism, but full-blown nihilism, a term actually forged by Jacobi in some sense to describe the destructive power of the Enlightenment, or Spinozism. Now, to be clear, Jacobi wasn't just being a religious stooge or anything like that. Something very much like this position was even held by the Scottish skeptic David Hume, who regarded Spinoza's system as, quote, true atheism backed by what he called the hideous hypothesis of his metaphysics. Well, Jacobi's answer was to introduce the importance of a kind of moderated form of belief, or even faith, Glaube, back into philosophy, though this was met by not a little scorn on the part of the Enlightenment folk. And I have to say that this whole pantheism controversy business, which I'm only covering here very thinly, reminds me a bit about contemporary debates about disenchantment and the re-enchantment of the modern world, whatever that is, in religious studies. That is, the idea that the Enlightenment scientific modernity stripped the world of religious and spiritual qualities, and that the new religious movements are, in various ways, attempting to re-inject spirituality and religion into contemporary life. I'll leave aside the question as to whether or not the world was ever really disenchanted. It wasn't. But the pantheism controversy really seems to be live now in a way that seems interesting to me now. But the key question was whether Spinoza's system led via pantheism to atheism and thus to nihilism, the destruction of all values. Oddly, the very prompt for the whole debate also became its solution in a sense. The rationalist Spinoza would soon become transformed into the romantic Spinoza. That Spinoza system would come to represent atheistic nihilism in one conversation, and a way of understanding the universe as an entity alive and teeming with consciousness in another, reveals just how tortured the conversation had become through the 18th and 19th centuries. The two would oddly come together in the German Romantics. As the dust settled following the Pantheismus, which my spell checker wants to make into Pantheism Street for whatever reason, it's over there by Sesame Street, the Romantics were increasingly interested in a religious philosophy in which divinity was radically immanent to the vast beauty and wonder of nature rather than some transcendent sky dad. God combined with nature? Deus sua natura, you say? Well, how about yet another Spinoza remix? German pantheism meets French vitalism to forge a truly romantic reading of Spinoza. It's here that we have the poet Novalis famously declaring that Spinoza is the man intoxicated with God, and Hegel arguing, quote, "The fact is that Spinoza is a made testing point in modern philosophy, so that it may be said, really, you are either a Spinozist or you're not a philosopher at all." Of course, Spinoza, for Hegel, is just the starting point for philosophy and not its culmination. The culmination will be Hegel. Of course it will be Hegel. Nietzsche even declared in 1881, "I have a forerunner, and what a forerunner," referring to Spinoza's focus on pure joy, such that, quote, as Spinoza would write, "the free person thinks least of all of death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death, but on life." For Nietzsche, Spinoza was a philosopher whose liberation from dogmatic theology, this in some ways prefigures the famous death of God, described in a book I might remind you called The Joyful Science, allowed Spinoza to uphold the values of life and joy rather than the servile, sad passions which so dominate Western philosophy and religiosity, according to Nietzsche. This quasi-mystical, or just mystical reading of Spinoza has perhaps no greater recent champion than the 20th century French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. For Deleuze, and this is a bit akin to Nietzsche, Spinozism is a philosophy of radical metaphysical immanence. This, of course, is to be contrasted with nearly 2,000 years of religion and philosophy in which reality, what is said to be truly real, whether it be the divine realm of religion, the realm of the Platonic forms, the Neoplatonic one, or the Gnostic world of light, is thought to be a realm transcendent to our own. For Deleuze, Spinoza represents a philosophy committed to a radical ontological immanence in which reality itself is an expression of an ontology seething with desire and power. Because Spinoza's system rejects ontological transcendence, Deleuze conceives of the Ethics, Spinoza's chief text, as a truly dangerous book to all of Western metaphysics, and in one of his seminars actually likens the book not only to a magical grimoire, but the most frightening of all tomes of sorcery. In one of his lectures on his infamously difficult book with Guattari, Anti-Oedipus, he declares that, quote, "The true name of the Ethics is the Necronomicon," a reference to that horrid volume in Lovecraftian lore. Yet, this most dangerous book of magic is said to be authored by a kind of savior, a philosophic messiah. In their final work together, What is Philosophy?, Deleuze and Guattari declare, quote, "Spinoza is the Christ of philosophers, and the greatest philosophers are hardly more than apostles who distance themselves or draw near to this mystery." We have in Spinoza almost too much to comprehend. From the arc rationalist employing the clarity and distinctness of the geometric method to exorcise all remnants of superstitions from the mind of modernity, to Spinoza the mystic and sorcerer, whose philosophy teems with joy and desire, conjuring away transcendence in favor of a radical metaphysics of immanence. According to his writ of excommunication, he was author of, quote, "abominable heresies," and according to his most recent prophet, nothing less than the Christ of the philosophers. But we leave Spinoza in perhaps the most difficult place imaginable, somewhere between heretic and Christ. But as he leaves us at the end of the Ethics, he reminds us, all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. All the more reason to study a bit of Spinoza's philosophy if you never have, and to give it another read, perhaps seeing it less as a text of philosophy, but perhaps as a grimoire with the power to threaten the very metaphysics of Western philosophy. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.